All right. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about cardio and weights and the role that they play in weight loss. And people always say, which one is better? And it's not really a question of which one is better. It's what do they do, okay? But first I'm going to talk about what needs to happen. And you may have seen this before. I did something like this. These are the things that have to be in place in order for weight loss to occur. And I didn't make these up. These are published. These things have to be in place. Anything that's not up there doesn't need to be there, okay? So the first thing, as we said earlier, fat loss is driven by a sustained calorie deficit, right? Everybody agrees with that. And we said any eating strategy works as long as you create that deficit, okay? Metabolic adaptation. You have to deal with metabolic adaptation. And what metabolic adaptation is, when you lose weight, you tend to burn fewer calories, okay? Light things burn fewer calories than heavy things. If you have a pickup truck and a motorcycle sitting in your driveway and both are idling, one of them is burning more gas just because it has a bigger engine. Think of your muscle as the engine, okay? The more you have, the more fuel it will burn, okay? It's critically important. Increasing muscle mass while you're in a calorie deficit requires more protein than the recommended daily allowance, a lot more protein, okay? We'll talk more about that here in a second. And finally, as we said before, your fat loss strategy has to be something you can do forever. If it's something that you're doing short term, it's not going to work, and you're going to have to do something else, okay? How many people have lost weight only to gain it back? How many people have gained more back than they were when they started? All right, we're going to talk about why that happens, okay? So this bar graph here shows what your total energy expenditure is throughout the day and what contributes to that. And you'll see that on this graph, you have the basal metabolic rate. And on the y-axis, you'll see those numbers. It goes up to 10,000. That's joules. That's just, I converted that into calories. So it's 2,400 calories on that scale. So if you look at the basal metabolic rate, your resting metabolism, you sitting here, counts for 60% of your total calorie burn throughout the day, okay? So just like the car idling in the driveway, it's just sitting there burning gas, right? That's what you're doing right now. You're burning fuel and you're putting off heat, just like your car does. Same thing, okay? And that idling, you sitting here, is what makes up most of your caloric burn. Now notice that it says physical activity only accounts, intentional exercise only accounts for about 20% of that burn, okay? Think about it. Your metabolic rate per day is burning, this person is burning 1,440 calories. Can you burn 1,400 calories through exercise in a day? You can if you get up at 8 in the morning and start running until 8 at night, right? You're not going to do that. So the thing is, if you can increase the resting metabolic rate, or if you can prevent it from falling, then you're in a much better spot, right? Okay. So let's look a little closer at this graph. So aerobic exercise has the greatest impact on your physical activity component, right? The more exercise you do, the more calories you're going to burn. Weight training has the biggest effect on the metabolism, okay? So weight training affects your basal metabolic rate, your resting metabolism, and aerobic exercise primarily increases your caloric burn throughout the day. Okay, and we'll talk more specifically about these things. People generally just think exercise is exercise, and we do it to increase caloric burn. That's not true, okay? All right, so let's talk about exercise and weight loss. Calorie restriction is much more effective than exercise for inducing weight loss. One time, I was thinking of how to explain this to my students, so I went into the gas station. My truck was on empty, and I timed how long it took me to fill my tank, 2 minutes. 2 minutes to fill my truck from empty to full. How long will it take me to burn all the gas in that tank? Can I do it in 2 minutes? No. It doesn't matter how hard I push that vehicle, I cannot burn that fuel in 2 minutes. And as long as I can put more energy into the system than I can get out, then calories are always going to be more important than exercise. So think about your body the same way. If I eat a 300-calorie muffin, how How long, does anybody know how long the average fast food sitting is? When you sit down at McDonald's, if you do this, to eat, how long are you in there on average? Anybody know? 7 minutes. 7 minutes, okay? So can you burn off all those calories you're eating in 7 minutes? No, you can't do that. Okay, so calorie restriction is far more effective than exercise in inducing weight loss. The majority of studies show little to no effect of exercise if you don't also have some type of dietary restriction in place. So what most people will do is they're slowly gaining weight over time. It's called creeping obesity. They might be gaining 2 to 3 pounds per year. And after 10 years, you look in the mirror and you go, what the hell happened to me? Right? I gotta start losing weight. What they don't realize is that they're slowly gaining over time. So when you start that exercise program in the absence of dietary restriction, all you're doing is stopping the gain. You're not inducing a deficit. So people will start dieting or start exercising rather, and 2 months later they'll say, it didn't do anything. Well, it prevented the gain. It may not have caused the loss, but it prevented the gain. And that's usually what exercise does. It's good at preventing gain, but it's not good at causing loss, okay? So there was one, there's been more than one, but one of the studies that I found that just looked at an exercise intervention, and it worked, okay? An exercise intervention was effective, provided these parameters were met. First of all, it was supervised, meaning the investigators, they would come in and they were actually watched. People would watch them, they were accountable. They burned 400 to 600 calories per session. That is a lot of calories burned. That's an hour of exercise, 400 to 600 calories. Done more than 5 times per week and done for a year. I don't exercise that much, right? So this is really hard to do. You have to do an enormous amount of exercise if you want to lose weight through exercise alone, okay? Exercise, as I said, it's much more effective at preventing weight gain than it is loss, okay? Dietary interventions that are combined with exercise interventions lead to greater weight loss than dietary interventions alone, right? So exercise and diet is better than diet alone, and changing your diet is better than exercise alone. Generally, aerobic exercise is better at causing fat loss than weight training. Okay, you burn more calories doing aerobic exercise than weight training. If I run on a treadmill for 30 minutes, I will burn more calories than if I weight train for 30 minutes. The point I'm trying to get is don't weight train so that you can induce a calorie deficit and burn a lot of calories. That's not why you should be doing it. You should be weight training to prevent muscle loss during a diet. Okay, and we'll talk more about that here in a second. Okay, and as I said, aerobic exercise combined with weight training is more effective than aerobic exercise alone. Okay? Now this graph, I think that if you can wrap your head around what's going on in this graph, you will know more than most of the people in the nutrition industry that I know, okay? Now this graph, I didn't make this up. I made the graph, but I adapted it because the original graph is a little complex. But if you, basically what happened here in this study is they took 12 people, and I think they were military recruits, and they basically put them in a semi-starvation diet where they cut their calories by half for 6 months. Okay? Yeah. So this on the, oh crap. Okay, well, we'll leave it up there. So on the bottom there, you see these 3 things that says fat mass, muscle mass, and calorie intake. That purple line I just put up there is their caloric intake. The dotted line at the 100% there, the blue line, the line that's parallel to the x-axis, that is their starting value, okay? So basically you can see at the start, they decreased their calories by 50%, and they held them at a 50% reduction for 6 months. And then they said, eat as much as you want. And what happened to their caloric intake? Their caloric intake skyrockets. Like if I starved you for 6 months and then said you could eat everything you want, what would you do? Right? Right? That'd be a train wreck. And so look what happens. They eat up to 180% of the original value. Their calorie intake is 80% higher than it was when they started. Now, what happens to their fat mass during that time? If you look at the red line, so this is their fat mass. If you look during the semi-starvation period, that 24 weeks, they have a huge decrease in fat. And then they start eating again. And what do you notice about the fat? It goes up. and it keeps going up, okay? So the point where the fat mass, how many people have heard of the set point theory in weight loss? The set point theory basically says that your body weight wants to stay at a certain thing. And when you deviate from that, the body's going to try really hard to get back to it. This is why weight loss gets harder the more weight you lose, okay? When the fat returns back to its baseline value, where's the calorie intake? The calorie intake is still about 30 to 40% higher than baseline, even though the fat has returned back to its normal, to its baseline value. Okay, so why is that? If we look at the lean mass, so the green line represents the muscle mass. And if you look at the point where the fat mass gets back to normal, you could see that the muscle mass has not yet recovered. Okay? The intake, the caloric intake, goes back to normal when the muscle mass reaches its baseline value, not the fat mass. And it's much easier to gain fat than it is to gain muscle. So if you're semi-starving for 6 months, your metabolism's tanking. It's falling. And now you're going to gorge yourself, and your body is saying, finally, I'm going to store all this stuff as fat. And it goes nuts until the muscle mass gets back to normal. And then once the muscle mass is back to normal, the brain says, okay, now we can go back to our normal intake pattern. And now, what do most people do when they want to lose weight? Do a lot of cardio and cut carbs, right? You're cutting your caloric intake, you're creating these huge calorie deficits, but you're not doing anything to protect the muscle mass. So when you finally fall off the wagon, you gain all this fat back, and now you have more fat than when you started because you didn't do anything to protect the muscle during that intervention. Okay? So what do the authors conclude here? This is called fat overshooting. And the idea is that in order to get that muscle mass back to normal, you need to be in this huge calorie surplus. Okay? So, the idea here is, would this happen if we prevented the muscle loss in the first place? If you could prevent the muscle from falling during that intervention and you only had a decrease in fat, then you wouldn't have to wait for the muscle to get back to its baseline value, and you wouldn't have this overshoot, okay? So we're interested in creating a calorie deficit, and we do that through aerobic exercise and calorie restriction. Weight training maintains the muscle mass or improves it and increases or improves it, or at least stays, the resting metabolic rate at least stays the same, okay? So how do you prevent muscle loss during dieting? This is the million-dollar question here, right? First, avoid very large calorie deficits. We showed the keto guy today that was in a 1,200 calorie deficit every day, right? What happened? He lost 10 pounds of muscle. Weight train. Weight training has been shown to decrease the amount of muscle that you lose during calorie restriction. So even if you don't increase your protein intake, just weight training will help prevent muscle loss during dieting, up until a point. Eventually, you're going to have to increase your protein intake or it's just going to keep falling. Eat more protein. So the RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilo of body mass. So let's use a 150-pound woman as an example. That comes out to roughly 50-some grams of protein, 53, 54, somewhere around there. In order to maintain your muscle mass while weight training in a calorie deficit, you need 2 to 3 times the RDA. So now that 55 grams of protein jumps to 165 grams of protein, which is very, very difficult to get through food alone. Okay? This is where the protein shakes come into play. Right? If everybody would drink 2 protein shakes a day, you'd increase muscle and lose fat doing nothing else. And that's been shown. That's been shown. That's been published. Okay? So that's not that hard to do. This last one doesn't really have anything to do with preventing muscle loss, but it's I didn't want to put it on its own slide. Aerobic exercise, as we said, it's more effective at creating a calorie deficit than weight training. Okay? But the calorie deficit shouldn't be created solely through aerobic exercise. Like if you were to burn 500 calories through aerobic exercise, a better option would be to decrease your calorie intake by 250 and increase your aerobic exercise by 250. Okay? You still end up with a 500 calorie deficit, but you're doing it through a combination of mild calorie restriction and mild aerobic exercise rather than going out running for an hour. Okay? So because you do a bunch of cardio, it's great for calorie burn, but it's not great for building muscle, right? And if you're calorie restricting doing a lot of cardio, that helps to actually lose muscle. So you have to do both of these things if you want to optimize that weight loss strategy, whatever that might be. So both aerobic exercise and weight training both play very important roles, but they're very separate. The things they do should be thought of as different sort of mechanisms with different sort of purposes. It's not as simple as just let's go exercise, okay? As I said, aerobic exercise creates the deficit, and mainly the weight training prevents the muscle loss. And we've already seen how important that is. All right, that's it. And we don't have time for questions. I'm over. So talk to me later.